Coming up, from Russia taking the lead in Syria to the growing efforts to stop Kurdish independence. We'll go in-depth on the stories defining the day in the Middle East. Plus, later, as tech giants get set to testify on Capitol Hill, a look at the future of war on social media. That and much more is coming up right now on Debrief. Welcome to Debrief. I'm Nari Ben, and it is almost 2 years to the day since Russia launched its military intervention in Syria. And those 2 years have made all the difference. Vladimir Putin's backing has helped the Assad regime essentially win on the ground. And now the Kremlin is playing a lead role in setting up the political future. Today, that's in process in Turkey. Putin and Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan sitting down together. What's on the table and why does it matter now? With us here in the studio is Eytan Cohen Yanarocak, a Turkey analyst at the Moshe Dayan Center. Hi, great to have you as always.
Thank you very much.
And with us from our studios in Washington is Mark Simakovsky. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Before that, serving as Europe and NATO Chief of Staff in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy. Mark, thank you very much for joining the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get to this meeting today, let's talk about this relationship between Turkey and Russia for a moment. We're talking about two countries that essentially have spent 6 years of war on opposite sides of the Syrian war. What is drawing them closer and closer together?
So for essentially the primary driver, I believe, is the need for Turkey understands that Russia is dominating the political solution as well as dominated the military solution in Syria. And as well, there's a need that Turkey sees in sending a signal to the West and to the United States that of its displeasure with the United States. And in that sense, there's a mutual dissatisfaction going on between Russia and Turkey of the U.S. and U.S. interests. So this meeting, again, is an acceleration of relations between Russia and Turkey. There's a lot on the table to talk about regarding the future of Syria, the S-400 deal that Russia signed with Turkey recently, as well as nuclear cooperation. So it really is a showcase of both sides getting over the Turkish shoot-down in 2016 and a willingness to move forward with relations.
Hi, the fact that Russia has clearly helped the Assad regime win the war militarily for the most part on the ground, has that changed Turkey's mind? Has that changed Turkey's plans for the future in terms of its cooperation?
Sure. When Russia intervened in Syria, Turkey had to recalculate its position vis-a-vis Syria and vis-a-vis Russia. At the end of the day, Russia is a very key player, and Russia is a superpower. And for centuries, the Turks did everything in order not to have a problematic relationship with the Russian Empire. And in this case, they readjusted their policy towards Syria, and instead of having a quarrel and a diplomatic friction between Moscow and Ankara, they chose to come to a common ground, and they tried to basically launch a rapprochement between the two states, and that's basically paved the way for the Astana summits.
Mark, if we're looking ahead at this relationship presumably continuing to get closer, and as you've said, moving past that shoot-down of the plane, what do you think that is going to practically mean for the Middle East, and particularly for Syria, to have those two countries on the same side?
You know, it actually will be very important. Russia-Turkish relations will have an impact on the future of Syria. They'll have an impact on the future of Iraq, as Russia and Turkey clearly are going to play a huge role in responding to the announcement of this referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan. It's going to also play a large role in how relations with Israel proceed. Frankly speaking, the Russia-Turkey cooperation and engagement will also have a huge role to play in what the U.S. and NATO's role are in the Middle East. Turkey is a NATO ally, and frankly speaking is showcasing displeasure with the alliance, displeasure with the West, and displeasure with Washington. And as a result, NATO has resisted and pushed back on Turkish interests in engaging with Russia, particularly on military cooperation.
Mark, are those two things...
So, you know, most important...
Are those two things compatible, to have a NATO ally along with Russia, which NATO often sees as a clear threat?
You know, I think they are potentially compatible. Turkey has been able to establish and maintain a decent relationship with Russia for years. That said, Turkey, I think, is trying to go a bit further than it has in the past, and it could create real headaches. And Turkey is facing pushback from the United States on some of its potential warming of ties with Russia.
Let's remind our viewers of some of the concrete issues being discussed there. We're talking about de-escalation zones in Syria. 3 of them are already up and running with Russia monitoring parts of Homs province. That includes, along with eastern Ghouta outside Damascus, and parts of Dera and Quneitra provinces in the rebel-controlled south. Now, recently, it has been Idlib province at the center of negotiations. Chai, when we're talking about those de-escalation zones, it looks like we're not only talking about a temporary area for a ceasefire, we're talking about lines of a future Syria being drawn.
Right. And now, tonight, both leaders are also talking about this Idlib non-conflict zones. And besides that, they're also talking about Kurdish referendum and also the S-400 missile purchase of Turkey from Russia. So there are 3 important issues. And when we are talking about Syria, yes, you're right. Turkey and Russia are trying to shape the future of Syria together with Iran. From the Turkish point of view, it's super crucially important since Turkey is the patron of the Free Syrian Army, and Turkey doesn't want to see that this Free Syrian Army will be deserted, because if they will be deserted, so they will come back into Turkey and they will terrorize inside Turkey. So Turkey would like to make sure that these entities will have a living space for themselves in the future Syria.
Mark, notably absent from these conversations, whether we're talking militarily or about a political solution in Syria and the area, is the United States, these days at least. With Russia taking the lead militarily and diplomatically, what do you think the U.S. role should be, if any?
You know, the U.S. is still playing a major role in Syria and obviously still uses Turkish airspace for operations in Syria. So the U.S. is still engaged with Syria at a very high level. President Trump also has tried to improve relations with Turkey. You know, I think the United States still has to keep its act and stay in the game. I think that a point that Putin's trying to make is to elbow out the United States, and he's using Turkey to try to decrease U.S. influence in the region. And the U.S. will need to maintain its engagement in the region and also help shape the future course of a peaceful Syria.
Mark Simakovsky in Washington, thanks very much for joining the conversation. And Chai, I want to get your reaction to that. If Turkey is being used in that way, is Turkey on board? Who would Erdogan like to be closer with these days if given the choice, President Trump or President Putin?
Okay. Turkey adopts an ambivalent policy. In order to maximize its interest in the West, it's making a rapprochement with Russia, and in order to maximize its interest in the East, so it
has to play both sides.
Yeah, both sides. So in this case, Turkey has also some, you know, when it sees the Syrian frontier, for example, there is a PYD there. The PYD is the ally of the United States, but from the Turkish point of view, it's a terrorist organization. So the Turks want to see a stop for the armament of this entity. On the other hand, when they are looking at Russia, despite the fact that they are not in the same alliance in NATO, they are seeing them as partners. So sort of like Russia is seeing Turkey and using Turkey as a Trojan horse inside NATO in order to weaken NATO. And United States is not using Turkey in order to maximize its interest in Syria and Iraq. Instead, they are using the Kurds, but it's very ununderstandable because now United States is also not recognizing the Kurdish independence in northern Iraq, and also it's very, ambiguous.
A Trojan horse inside NATO, an interesting point there. Chai, stay with us. You just mentioned it. Kurds, Turkey, obviously, not the only thing. Syria is not the only thing on the agenda for Turkey these days. Still to come, we'll look at that. Iraqi Kurds called for their independence with a resounding yes vote in Monday's referendum. But now they face even bigger opposition from Iran to Turkey to the United States. Welcome back to Debrief. In Iraq, the Kurdish referendum on independence is over. The result, a resounding yes, but the fight in many ways is only now getting started. From the central Iraqi government, from Turkey, Iran, and the U.S., there were plenty of warnings and attempts to stop the vote before. Now that it happened, those warnings are turning into some concrete action. The latest, Baghdad calling for all foreign flights to and from Erbil to be suspended as of tomorrow evening. And along with it, Turkey calling on all its citizens to leave northern Iraq before it stops flights from there. Joining us from Washington is Kani Zulam. He's director of the American Kurdish Information Network. And here with me in the studio are senior Middle East correspondent Mohammed Al-Qasim, and still with us, Eytan Cohen Yanarocak, a Turkey analyst at the Moshe Dayan Center. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. Let's just start off with the most recent offer to mediate. Amid all the threats made to the Kurds, do not move forward with independence. There is an offer from the United Nations.
That's correct. The United Nations just offered its services to mediate between Erbil and Baghdad. This is something that the Iraqi foreign minister, told in a statement, or reported in a statement, and it sounds like the Iraqi government is receptive to the idea. And I would be surprised if the Kurdistan regional government declines the offer. I think they would like to engage in some sort of dialogue between them and the Iraqi government. So this is a good sign that maybe tension is de-escalating between the two sides, but we are still to hear from both sides on whether they'll do it or not.
Explain to us and our viewers briefly the importance of stopping flights. It seems like maybe an arbitrary punishment, but we're talking about a city that is an international hub that the Kurds have sort of created. What are the implications of that threat?
Huge implications, Nurit. And we're not only talking about the city of Erbil, we're talking about the entire Kurdistan region here. Two major airports in Kurdistan, one in Erbil, which I flew into more than once this year, and the other one in Sulaymaniyah, which is a lot smaller. Erbil is right now the hub for many NGOs, for the United Nations, as an example, and many other NGOs, but also many other countries go through Erbil to service the refugees and do business in Erbil, as it's the capital of Kurdistan region in Iraq. So this will have huge implications in terms of the economy, how it's going to hurt the economy. Keep in mind that Kurdistan region is a landlocked region. It doesn't have any water outlet, so they rely on air and the ground. And if they are locked on both air and ground, this will be a major challenge for them.
So, Kani, with that immediate threat and the obvious implications that we hear about here, how do you think Kurds are going to react? How do you think Barzani is going to react now to those flights being stopped?
Well, Barzani has calculated that into his decision. Turkey, for example, trades with Iraq in the tune of $9 billion per year, and most of that trade goes through Iraqi Kurdistan. And if that stops, Turkey is going to suffer too. There are going to be hundreds of thousands of people without jobs. The solution is, as UN has, taken the initiative, is dialogue for these people to talk. The Kurds didn't commit a crime. They didn't, declare even independence. They haven't declared a war. They have simply exercised their political will. And, Baghdad should come to its senses, so has Turkey, and talk to Iraqi Kurdish leadership.
Well, Kani, we have heard Barzani saying that this vote is not an announcement, a declaration of a new state on its own, that it is an opening for negotiations. But you say they maybe should sit down, but it doesn't seem like there is any willingness, any interest to actually sit down and talk, whether it's about independence or anything else.
Well, the Constitution that was put together in 2005, that was passed with the support of the Kurds too, says this is a voluntary union of the states, meaning the provinces. So the Kurds are voluntarily part of Iraq, and if they want to secede, that's their prerogative as well. But if Iraq wants to threaten, just 3 years ago, Iraq ran away from 1,500 ISIS fighters. It doesn't have the means to implement what it wants to implement. And the Kurds, are saying, we don't want to have a fight with you, but if you have to come and invade us, we're going to fight back.
Kani, I want to come back to you in a moment on that, a very important part of this whole story, which is the fight against IS. But Iraq is not the only country threatening the Kurds.
Sure.
Turkey certainly as well, and using oil to do it.
Yeah. Turkish army and the Iraqi army, they basically launched a joint military drill next to the border. But as you mentioned, the most important factor here is the oil. But you should also do not forget another important actor, which is called Russia. That's why Mr. Vladimir Putin just landed in Ankara, because there is a very important Russian firm called Rosneft.
Right.
They are very much, they are very much present in the KRG region, and they are making great profits. And the boss of that Rosneft is a very close associate of Vladimir Putin, and also the KRG government. Besides that, also Turkish government in the past did many positive things in order to make it easier for the KRG to export its oil. And let us not forget, the first client in the world was Israel. Through Turkey, of course, Turkey knew it, so it was a win-win situation. For whom? For Israel, for Turkey, for KRG. And who was damaged there? Iraq.
Kani, so let's get back for a moment to IS, because we see that their interest in oil, their interest in borders, there is such a complex situation, and in the backdrop of all of it is the fight against IS. The Kurds have been a key ally for the United States in that fight. Will the way this has played out and U.S. reluctance to support or even condemnation of the vote, will that change how Kurds fight the Islamic State?
Well, the Kurds, not just in Iraq, but also in Syria, as we talk, are fighting IS. As your guest pointed out, Russian oil company has invested $4 billion worth of investment in Iraqi Kurdistan in its oil fields. The superpowers, principal powers, they need to, if they want this fight to continue, if they want to be effective against IS, then they cannot afford to alienate Kurds. They cannot afford to turn their back to the Kurds, because that will mean, IS gets breathing space, if you will. So I think, this huff and puff will eventually go down, and cooler heads will prevail, and the Kurds are part of the Middle East. We're not aliens there. We're part and parcel of the Middle East geography, and we have to learn to live together. But if war comes, the Kurds have said repeatedly they're ready for it too.
On that note, Mohammed, you have just come back from Erbil, where you were covering the lead up to that vote and the aftermath. Give us a little bit of a sense of what you heard from people there, what their hopes really are for the long term.
Well, obviously their hopes and dreams are very clear in the results. I mean, the results reflects what the Kurdish people wanted. You have a unanimous 93%. That's an unheard of number, that almost the entire population agreed on one item, and that is yes for a referendum. But at the same time, they are just like everyone else. They want a regular life. They want to be able to go to work and have a normal life. And by having all these sanctions on, or if they would to be, and it will make their lives very hard, then they may have to rethink how they would achieve their dream, their long time dream. So I think right now they are still living the euphoria of passing this referendum with a yes. But at the same time, even the top political leadership in Kurdistan is trying to find a way out of how to contain this international pressure and this tension that was created by the referendum regionally and with Iraq, and save face, not only for the Kurdish leadership, but also for the Iraqi leadership.
One small step, but a long way to go. Hi, Mohammed, thank you very much for being with us. Kani in Washington, Kani Zulam, thanks very much for joining the conversation. We're going out for a quick break here. When we're back, Trump's on